Hello friends, I'm our substitute emo for today, and we're doing just another backlog review. We have enough blocking issues that's probably all we'll get to today, but gotta start somewhere. Okay, first up, add is async overload for create, open, etc. Number 2, 4, 6, 9, or 8. Adam, you're up. Okay, so interesting. Create already has one, or did you just miss the plus? Okay. And yeah, so like looking at the options that exist on file options, like delete on close, and encrypted, like they make sense for create, but some of them do feel a little weird for, like, if you call open read with delete on close, does that get ignored? Does it complexly do something? Does it throw? What? That's me. Did somebody make some noise?
Can YouTube hear us?
My meter said sound came through that channel.
I'm waiting to see if Discord or YouTube tells me it's working now. It's working now.
Hooray! Gotta love when changing a setting to its current value changes things. Alright.
So I have checked the files in constructor. It seems that we don't have any logic that this allows for opening for reading and removing the file after when closing.
So if you call file.openRead and pass delete on close, it will delete the file on close?
Yes, it will try.
And if you call... Go ahead.
And this is the behavior that FileStream constructor exposes. So
I guess that's fair. All of these things are... These are just accelerators for existing...
yes.
Like, calling open is just calling it with... Actually, open's the weird one. Calling open read is just calling it with file access.read. And... Okay, because, yeah, my one concern was just going to be how much of this enum doesn't make sense for these operations, but they're... I guess that doesn't really matter. Okay, so I didn't look at file. Is this basically all of the path-taking methods, which should be all of the methods on file? Adding an overload that takes file options?
Yes.
And similarly for file info, all the things that return a file stream or a stream reader?
Exactly.
Put the space in the wrong spot there, Adam. All right. Does anyone want to have an opinion on Stream Reader and Stream Writer since Adam was ambivalent?
Scenario makes sense to me.
I agree. Anyone want to object?
I mean, the path is always a file, right? Like, that's the only thing it can be.
It does not need to be a regular file. It can be a type. Like, for example, on Linux, you could have a path pointing to standard input or output.
But that would still open with file stream.
Yes.
Like it's just gonna, it's just deferring everything to calling file stream, I think.
Yes.
Right. And so this is doing
But
just
it's
the
not
ones that
something
take.
crazy like
Go.
if you can't pass in like an HTTP or an FTP or anything like that in Stream Reader to the path, or can you? That would be crazy.
I don't remember
I
if
don't think this is
file stream
possible.
supports that.
I think it depends on what file stream supports.
So Stream Reader with the path just goes straight to file stream for all these.
Yes,
true?
exactly.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
I think functionally speaking, there's nothing preventing you from setting up a pipe that redirects to an HTTP server or a UNC share or anything like that. There's nothing preventing someone from doing that. I don't think you can directly pass in like an HTTP address to the path, though.
Yeah. So looking at implementation, the one thing that maybe seems a little interesting with Stream Reader and possibly Stream Writer is it's already calling file stream and specifying sequential scan. I guess if you didn't want it to do past the sequential scan, you could just yourself open the file stream and call and use Stream Reader with the first argument being a stream. But how do we feel about the fact that it's going to presumably OR in flags that you didn't specify? Or are we going to make the caller specify sequential scan, which means we'd need to document the overload that it's not, just passing default?
Would setting the file options to sequential scan as default value of the argument solve the problem?
I don't think so, because if we're implicitly ORing it in, it has to be documented. Otherwise, users will pass something that doesn't include it and then wonder why it's being passed.
Yeah. So
we
in that
can
case,
modify the documentation for that case, right?
Yes.
We are already doing that. It's not a breaking change. So, yeah, if we pass a file options, that means we can override that.
Right. Well, I mean, like two options are one, you OR in the flag, and the other is if they pass the file options, you just take whatever they give you, and you just have slightly different paths between the two. It's really just a question of this is a API implementation, not really dissociated, so making sure that we're aware of the consequences before we add it.
If you didn't do sequential scan on a Stream Reader, like that's just not going to work, is it?
it's going to work. It's just a hint to operating system about how you are going to use the file.
Oh.
And for example, if you specify random file access on Linux, the OS is not caching the data. If you don't, it's caching it. So it's just a hint. And we could do a thing like if user haven't asked for random file access on purpose, we can OR the sequential scan.
Fair enough. Like again, I'm just bringing it up as the only possible objection, is it gets complicated with implementation. But based on the surface, it all seems fine to me.
I have a question. This relates to the other FileStream API that we are proposing. The other API proposal is adding another argument to file info, I think Stream Reader as well. So I was wondering, and I left the questions there, if it would make sense to instead pass a class that grabs the elements. We do a similar thing in file system enumerable, where we pass a class with all the parameters, and we can expand the class with anything new that we want to add, instead of adding overloads and overloads. And Adam gave an answer below saying that we could, if we add a new class, let's say we need file stream options, that will add a new allocation, so that could be a disadvantage. But I wanted to hear the opinion here in a meeting.
I think a struct would be better. It avoids the allocation while still allowing the same thing for these scenarios. But I think that depends on how much more we think that this is going to expand. Given that this is like the first change in basically ever to the APIs we're exposing here. And there's the discussion and issues about a broader changes to stream anyways. It might be better to just keep it as is for now.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Can you give me a sense of how much other stuff you're wanting to add?
So if you switch to the 4th tab, this is 5th. Yeah, this one. So file stream pre-allocation. So to tell the long story short, when we are creating a new file as of today, we don't specify any hint to us about the size. So the size is equal to 0. And then every next write to the file extends the file. And so first of all, this by specifying the hint upfront, we can have a performance advantage. And this could be used in places like file.writeAll, file.copy. So basically everywhere that we know the size upfront. And another use case is when there is not enough space. And a good example is when you try to copy a file, we create a new file, then we copy a part of the content, and at some point of time we get to the place that there is not enough space available, and we throw an exception. And by exposing an API that allows for specifying the size up front, we could get the exception immediately.
Fair enough. So right now we're talking the existing flags plus an optional, but this is really only to create. Like it only makes sense to create.
Yes, Carlos has edited this proposal, and in the first sentence you have a link. API proposal can be found here. No, the first one. Yeah. And here I have already included the file option flags. So assuming the first idea would get approved.
Fair enough. Okay, so it's not a huge amount of stuff, and it really only matters for file.create when we're talking about the file accelerators.
Right. It doesn't affect open and the other.
So stream reader is unaffected. Stream writer is okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess on the one hand, having a struct that encompasses all of this seems sane, but I'm having trouble with incremental additions, and have we hit the point where it's worth adding another way of thinking about it, or do we just keep incrementing?
So I like this idea. However, these types are quite old, and introducing a new type of creating them, I think it would be a little bit inconsistent. So maybe this is something that we should be doing in new types.
Right. If these were new types and you wanted to pass this many options, we'd say it feels like you're too complicated, maybe you want to, what are all of my options? Eric?
I was going to ask, what would you call the struct? Because the word file option or the term file option is already taken.
I was proposing file stream options, but I don't know if that's even worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd go with what we have proposed. I guess I wouldn't add a new struct to this.
Yeah, and then I think in YouTube there's a comment of it's annoying that the file async is not the default. According to at least Steve Tobe, you often will have a performance reduction with the file system if you pass the async flag. That even doing an async operation with the general synchronous file handle is usually your fastest option, but your mileage may vary. That's why it's an opt-in. Okay, so yeah, my inclination is for looking at it from I want to open files with the async flag and then the possible other flags that may ever get added in the future. I think this proposal to me looks good as proposed. Any dissent?
Nope.
Right. We'll see how much that is vaguely compilable code. Hey, syntax highlighting works now. Great, what'd I break here? Copying and pasting is hard, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
It looks like Tobe did have concerns at the end of this issue. Did we address those concerns? One more up. One more up. Did we verify that this in reality is beneficial?
So yes, it is, because it allows you for scaling up. However, as Jeremy said, typically when you are using FileStream and your app does not need to scale up, the fastest way to perform I/O is synchronous I/O. And then because of the overhead we had in the past, doing synchronous I/O on a thread pool, the second option, so this is the trap that people run into, it was also faster than actually specifying asynchronous upfront and then using asynchronous methods. However, with all of the work that we have recently done in FileStream, now reading and writing of the file is up. So reading is up to 2 times faster and writing is up to 5 times faster, the asynchronous operations. So I believe that we have outdated the previous statements. However, I can provide benchmark results if this is required. And Stephen added this comments very recently, and I didn't have the time to prepare the benchmarks for him.
I imagine it's also a case of it depends on your workload, and this isn't like the only option that's being exposed. It's just one possible thing that you can do with the new APIs.
Right, like maybe you really wanted to do file.open read with delete on close. Now it's there. But yeah, I mean, as Steve said, these are really just convenience, because everything here is you could open FileStream directly instead of using the file accelerators or the path accelerators off of Stream Reader and Writer. But I think it's fine.
Okay. If Steve's happy, I'm happy.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a chance that he'll have objections when it comes time for implementation and that we end up not doing it, but I think as long as we feel that we're justified in the thing, the surface area is correct.
Yep, sounds good.
So we'll let Steve do feature review, and we'll just limit this one to API review.
Maybe Adam can follow up with Steve, to make sure that he's okay.
All right, so I guess since we already talked about the pre-allocate, let's just go ahead and jump to that one. So file stream pre-allocation 35946. Sorry, 45946. So we already heard the summary, and now this is, you want to add allocation size.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure how to name the argument. The underlying Windows API uses allocation size name, so I was like,
What does
maybe we can reuse it, because on the other hand I could use just a size or file size.
or size hint, or what's POSIX call it?
Let me check this.
So I have a question regarding what would be the behavior when passing this hint. I mean, does the OS, I mean the file system, like allocate the whole size on the disk, or just like doing something else?
As far as I know, it allocates the entire size.
Okay.
What do these overloads look like in combination with the previous overloads we just reviewed, which look to touch the same APIs?
So the first one is independent because it's adding it to file stream, and the previous proposal didn't add it. The second, the stream writer, it's just extending the method that we have added in the previous one with another optional argument.
Okay.
And the third one and the fourth one are actually new methods, new overloads.
Okay.
But only on the longest, like for file create.
Yeah, right. The files that create with file options already exist, so actually the new overload is filing for the filing. And as I said, the main benefit of this feature will be like improved perf for all of the operations where we know the file size up front, and also improved reliability by just throwing quickly.
Does this get ignored when you're not creating a file, when you're opening it? Or does it throw if you've specified an allocation size?
That's a very good question. What would you suggest? I think we should just ignore it, but I don't have strong opinions.
Yeah, I guess I would just ignore it as well, but
Yeah, I mean, you could look at some things like if file access doesn't include write, then throw of why are you specifying the thing. But then again, that's really just saying like, you're giving me nonsense now when you change something else that's possibly nonsense later, or ignore it. But if you do the creator open, I guess, yeah, if you do creator open, is that going to suggest to the OS to increase the allocated size? Is it possibly going to suggest to the OS to decrease the allocated size? Though I think it would have to actually commit in order to do that. So those are the fact that file stream takes the verb of what you want to do as a peer does make it slightly complicated, because some of the things don't matter and some of the things need we need to document what the behavior is, and then we need to make sure that it's the same across all of our operating systems. Of what does open or create do when it exists, when it doesn't exist, when it exists and the hint is bigger, when it exists and the hint is smaller. So there's a lot of documentation that will be associated with this simple looking addition.
How do you do this in POSIX? Do we know?
If I remember correctly, there is f_allocate method that you need to call.
So I wonder if we need to start defaulting file stream constructor parameters. Because if all that you really care about is I want to do, create with this allocation size, both file.create and filestream are going to make you pass an awful lot more data than you really care about.
Well, we do have a forward compatible way, provided we only have one method that overloads, or the two methods only one method that has defaults, or the two methods that have defaults. There's no implicit conversion. Like the stream and string case, there's no implicit conversion between string and stream, so that's safe.
Which would...
So we could definitely add it.
Yeah, basically be on this really long signature, figure out what we think that the mandatory parameter should be and default the rest.
It looks like file access and forward should be defaultable.
Right, based on the existence of this one.
Yeah, standard is right. We have default values for them.
Right, because I noticed that StreamWriter, it got added as defaulted parameters, but the file.create and filestream, it did not.
Yeah, and here I can explain myself. So first of all, I don't have a lot of experience in doing API. This is actually my first meeting ever, and I have noticed that StreamWriter is the only API that uses optional arguments. You can see its fourth constructor has some default values. So this is why I have decided to reuse this concept in StreamWriter. However, for file and file info and file stream, I didn't want to introduce anything new in these terms.
Some of that is just because up until basically .NET Core, we said optional parameters are bad, don't ever expose them. And then we changed our minds on that, and so newer APIs, we've started allowing it. There are definitely considerations, like you have to version them very carefully. If you've got one method that has optional parameters, and then you add another method with optional parameters, you actually have to make the original one no longer optional and basically forward to the new one, where the new optional is an extension to the previous list. Roslyn has an entire doc of explaining how you do this correctly, because it's very difficult to get right.
Could you share a link to the doc?
Yeah.
Thank you.
We also wrote it in Framework Design Guidelines 3rd edition. If only I got paid every time I mentioned the book. It would be more often than I currently get paid. I mean, being an author is a satisfying secondary career. Yes.
I posted it both in Discord and YouTube chat.
Okay. think I'm done copying and pasting. All right, since I actually don't know what the defaults are on anything, I just wrote in appropriate default. Yeah, so I think it basically is going to look like this minus the 1 plus.
Do we know how common the need to pre-allocate a file is? Does NT create file just block until the file system guarantees the storage?
To be
Because
honest,
I
I
know
don't
just
know the
setting
answer
the
to
end
this
of
question.
file does that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to anticipate Steve questions, have we tested using this and see that it is actually valuable to have?
We didn't. The user who asked for that did. And also when I was improving the performance of write async, I have noticed in the profiles that extending the file takes some extra time.
Fair enough. And that if we passed the option in, like basically it's given the shift off of magnetic storage and onto solid state devices, does the OS even respect this anymore? Like, does it matter on an SSD?
I think it does. However, I can get back to you with some numbers.
And even if it doesn't matter on an SSD, there's plenty of users that don't have SSDs or who have non-SSD secondary drives.
Fair enough.
There's network storage cases, etc. So, and of course, you've got Linux versus Mac versus Windows versus iOS versus Android. So many cases where I imagine it would be beneficial on at least one of them.
Well, fragmentation also slows down SSDs, so I don't know why it wouldn't have any effect there.
Adam, you mentioned that there are several places where we could get benefits from this. Do you expect to make other changes across our own libraries to utilize this overload?
Yes, I actually expect that this will be the follow-up of introduction of this API. I expect that you will improve the performance of file.write all text, write all bytes, file.copy. Also, I have seen places in compression where we know the size up front. So I expect that we will perform a research and basically use it everywhere where we can and where we can take advantage of it. And of course, write the benchmarks first and ensure that it actually makes sense.
I'd also imagine even if it does block on create, that's still more beneficial in some scenarios than blocking while it resizes every 2,000 bytes.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how much other file system work you have going on. I know that peer-to-peer clients for downloading super large files have done this pre-allocation in the past, just to make sure that they're not fragmenting like crazy when they download a 2 gig file or something.
Yeah, Steam does the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good when you're going to get the writes in out of order chunks so that you've already set up the place for, I would like to write here in the middle. At least with spinning magnets it does. Or where the magnets are not what spins.
One other question regarding the behavior. Does this going to affect the seek operation on the stream at all or not? I mean, like, if I give some hint and I say seek from the end, does it seek to the size we give or to the real size that we wrote to the file?
I think that the behavior will be equivalent for creating the file stream as of today, and then calling set length, and then calling seek. So we are basically delegating it to the OS and doing whatever it does.
So, given that we already have filestream.setLength, to ask Steve's question from the previous one in a different way, is this common enough that it's worth the extra API, or should somebody just do the 2 steps of get the file stream, then call set length?
Yeah, the benefit of having a new API is a possibility to do it in an atomic way. So I want to create a file at a given size, not create a file and then extend it. And I want to fail fast. So that's an advantage.
So Windows has that as part of the create file to begin with?
Yeah.
Because with POSIX, it is just the 2 steps you said.
Yes. However, here I'm relying on the research that was done by the user who posted the original request. So I will verify if there is no API, for example, on Linux that is not POSIX compatible. That would allow for
Fair
that.
enough. And do we really need all, do we need all 4 that are proposed? Like file.writeAllBytes is going to have done presumably just calling the file stream constructor directly. Do we have anywhere in our code that would use fileinfo.create and want to pass this? And this comes back to I guess this was Carlos' question of should we just start having the class here so that we don't need to be adjusting things in the future? And this is just the kind of like how many places are worth adding for allocation size, and if it's a corner case, then maybe they have to write an extra line of code. I don't have strong opinions here. I'm just asking the questions.
That's a very good question. Let me take a look at how file.write all is implemented.
Because I assume all text will use StreamWriter because that has the encoding stuff built into it. But write all bytes, I imagine it's just file stream. But that's just guess. While he's looking at that, does anyone have any other types of objection?
Nope.
Nope, makes sense to me.
So file write all text uses StreamWriter constructor, which internally calls file stream constructor. And write all bytes uses file stream constructor directly. So I think that your point is very good. So maybe all we need is a new overload for file stream constructor.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly could get away with it there. But then, you do get the... I guess the problem is when you're using StreamWriter, you don't actually... I mean, you can be smart enough, I guess, to know what the allocation size would really be if you're writing text, because you know what encoding you've picked, and if you pick an easy one, then you have an easy... You have a hope of guessing the allocation size. Yeah, because we don't do anything fancy. UTF-16 is just straight up ×2. I wonder if I guess it's just the 4th one. Like 3 of them seem reasonable. The 4th one seems marginal, but it completes the story. So yeah, it seems fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Up next is Adam.
Yeah. So the good news is that it's the last API proposal related to files. Both Windows and Unix expose a way to read and write at a given offset. And however, and as of today, we don't have a primitive that allows for that. You can seek the file stream to give an offset and then call read or write. However, this is not atomic. Moreover, file stream is not thread safe. So you should not be using it for writing or reading in parallel. And Alex, the author of the original issue, who works at some Azure team, they requested for a feature that would basically expose underlying Windows overlapped I/O feature, which allows you for doing a lot of asynchronous reads and writes at the same time, but at different offsets. And so, moreover, we are also introducing a breaking change to FileStream in .NET 6, because so FileStream was never officially thread safe. However, we were pretending that we allow for multiple concurrent reads and writes. However, to fix some of the issues that were there for a long time, we have introduced locking in FileStream itself. So you actually won't be able to, for example, start multiple read async operations and then await all of them at the end. And this is why we would like to introduce 2 new primitive types. The goal is just to allow for reading and writing at specific offset. And also another lesson that we have learned from Stream is that maybe combining, like allowing for asynchronous and synchronous operations in a single type wasn't the best idea, I would say. So this is why we would like to have 2 primitives, one that allows for reads and writes at specific offset in synchronous way, and another that allows for that in asynchronous way.
These APIs would be not for Windows only, right? It would be for all platforms.
Yes, on Linux, on Unix, we would be using pread and prewrite methods that works for C-cable streams only.
These things aren't streams, though.
They're
by
not.
design.
By design, and one reason for that is we don't really want to have a concept of current position.
So aside from the fact that we're introducing new things, I guess the comments or the feelings that I have are, first, I know that FileStream currently has length as a property, but that feels that really only makes sense as a property when you are opening for read. It probably should really be a method saying you don't get to, you shouldn't assume that it doesn't change. Like the fact that it's updated as side effects of calling write really feels like you want length to be, get length. To be clear, like you might want to check this again at some point. And then the problem with asynchronous random access file only having async API is at some point you may be in a synchronous callback, and what you were given as the file that you need to write to is this thing, and now you're forcing sync over async. Which is why we have the consider, I think, having a synchronous version of any async thing that you add.
Yeah, I would also add it's becoming slightly more common to have a method, an async method that implements both synchronous and asynchronous paths. That'll become quite a bit more interesting to do when you have 2 completely separate classes depending on each path. What's the benefit here of splitting them up like this?
Yeah, so actually having that in FileStream was a big problem, and one of the reasons why we have decided to rewrite it, because the logic was like basically every method. So first of all, every method in FileStream was first of all checking if given type is actually FileStream or a type that there is from FileStream, and then we had the logic that was checking if this is FileStream created for synchronous I/O or asynchronous I/O. And by separating these two concepts, and also like we have seen people like forgetting about passing is async to FileStream constructor and creating FileStream for synchronous I/O and using it in asynchronous way later. So this is why we wanted to kind of simplify it and make it obvious that you have two separate types, and one allows for synchronous things, another for asynchronous things. And these two primitives are more targeted at kind of super users who really want to get high performance. So I don't expect these types to be commonly used. And maybe this is why Steven and Jan were suggesting that maybe instead of introducing new primitive types, we could introduce just safe file handle extension methods, which is the alternative design proposed here.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess the answer to the if you got called in the synchronous callback is, since it's exposing the safe file handle, you could take the safe file handle, wrap it in, or then call random access files safe file handle based constructor, and then call the synchronous operation on that one. So you do have a way you can do it, I guess.
Yes, but we could verify that given handle, like we would have to actually verify that given handle was created for asynchronous I/O or synchronous. And this is also what FileStream constructor does internally as of today, when you are creating it out of the handle.
Oh, so calling new random access file of a file handle that was opened in async mode will fail?
Yes, it should fail.
Okay, so we're back to the if you're forced in a synchronous context, but the only file that you have to write to is in the async mode. It's nice to not force someone to do sync over async. I mean, maybe that's exactly what we're doing because it's an async file handle and we're calling the synchronous API, but like we're at least doing what we think the best thing that we can do with the OS is, as opposed to making the caller make something up, which usually is invoke the task and then, you know, call get await or get results and ignore the fact that it's yelling at them.
What's the behavior of the async API if the OS doesn't support an atomic overlapped write?
So Windows supports it, and also Unix supports it as well.
Right, but what about iOS and Android, or some theoretical IoT platform that can't support it?
That's a good question. However, I don't have an answer for it. Like, I think that some of similar powerful things are just not supported on some of the platforms, like in browser, for example. I'm not sure.
Right, but is this supposed to be we expect PNSE in the constructor, or we expect a PNSE when you actually call write, or is it going to say, well, the OS didn't support overlapped, so I'm going to just call seek, and now it's actually went from a type being designed for thread safety and it's no longer thread safe? Or
so I would expect a warning from an analyzer, because you would attribute it with not supported platform attribute. And if user still manages to get into this situation, throw in the constructor.
Okay, so PNSE.
Yes.
The other idea, you can have a factory method instead of constructors here. And factory methods can give some hint if it's supported or not. Returning null handle or something like this.
Yeah, I was gonna say adding the new classes feels wrong in ways that I can't articulate. So hopefully somebody else can. And the notion of maybe we add them as extension methods off of say file handle seems a little better, but then the problem is where would we describe the whether or not your platform supports it. And I guess really we would go back to name the class that has the extension methods something useful like overlapped file operations, and then it could have a is supported, and then it has these extension methods off of safe file handle. But then can you ask the safe file handle if it's in async mode?
It has an internal property.
Right, but if we're making the caller, or if we're going to throw, then we need to throw on a thing that the caller can inspect. So we would need to make that be exposed data somewhere. Yeah, that would be true on the current proposal as well. Of unless the expectation is, oh, try asynchronous. Nope, that threw. Okay, wrap it in the synchronous version.
Yeah, and another requirement is that the file needs to support seeking. So we actually need to verify that handle is either synchronous or asynchronous, and the underlying stream allows for seeking, underlying file, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I joined late. So is the idea that effectively, because we can't make stream performant enough, we would have new types?
Not performant enough. FileStream is not thread safe by default, and we also don't support reading and writing at given offset in atomic way. And these two primitive types would allow for that.
Who's the intended consumer? Like in general, who do we think would actually use this?
So for example, the team that asked for that, they're building some high performance Azure service. And they had to basically implement some interop wrappers for Windows overlapped API on their own to be able to have a single kernel object that represents a file handle and perform multiple reads at the same time.
So it's definitely not the quote unquote typical .NET developer.
Yes.
I mean, in a sense, it's not unlike what we have done in the past with the enumeration APIs, right? I mean, we do have enumeration APIs, with directory dot enumerate files and whatever, right? But we also have a struct-based enumerator, but that is more advanced and not very convenient to use, but it's very fast. So these two types I can see being similar, but to echo Jeremy's point, I mean, it is a bit concerning if you have a net new type that effectively you can't use anywhere, right? Because you basically, in order for it to be used, somebody has to write basically the code to actually do anything with it, right? We don't have any sort of adapter to stream, we don't have an adapter to pipeline, so basically you have access to the file, but you go write the loop that basically gets the data out, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly make a reader built on top of these. I guess you could probably make a writer. But yeah, it feels weird. If we think it's going to be it is a power scenario. So now the question is, no matter if we are adding new types that aren't just a static class for possibly being extension methods, is being in System.io too visible?
I mean, we can always introduce a sub namespace, right? Somebody with enumeration. I don't know how we would call that, but
right. Because the premise, like the Windows APIs or the Windows file system concept for this is overlapped. So I do see that there's the suggested overlapped instead of random access, and then that seems
and it only works on Windows.
a better name.
It also works on Unix.
Okay, so it's not specific to Windows then.
Yeah, it's just
and
specifically not the mobile devices.
Sure.
And actually, the original proposal was using the overlapped file name, but a lot of people expressed the concern that it's too Windows specific. And this is why I have changed it to random access file.
Fair. Yeah. So what does POSIX consider this concept to be?
So POSIX is not introducing any name. They have just a method that is called pread and prewrite. So they don't have a type.
Right. Because it's C-style API, right? There's basically structs and
Right.
So
functions.
we could call it p file.
What's the P? POSIX, position?
Probably
yeah,
POSIX.
These classes don't have any sort of abstraction to them like stream. Do we expect nobody to need something like that?
They are unique in a way because other streams, like I believe sockets, they don't support reading and writing at a given offset. So this is why it's specific to files.
Possibly, but maybe I have some protocol to access a file in a random access way over a network, and I want to implement some, the same class that does that.
Yeah, that is kind of the concern I think Jeremy has, is because this thing basically sits on the side, right? Like it's literally at the very bottom of what you do, and so you can't really compose this, right?
I mean, as safe file handle extensions, it wouldn't either, because if you're introducing a new protocol basically for doing it, you wouldn't be able to get that in the way of the file handles. I mean, you could. You just have to write a file system device driver, which is not fun. I mean, it might actually be really fun. But
I'm not sure that it's actually as complicated to use this API as we might be thinking. Really, users just care about I can read and I can write, and that's what this API exposes. You give it your input, it writes it to the offset. It could internally buffer it if that's appropriate for it to do, just like file can.
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, like the sample code is pretty straightforward, right? All I think we are basically saying is that almost nobody does that with Stream, right? Like people don't go to an XML document and enumerate buffers and then write them to a stream, right? They just call an API that does that for them, right? And so if we have these two new types, that's fine. But then there's fallout work in order to make those useful, right? People want to write ins, longs, or JSON or XML, and then because there is no common abstraction, it makes it relatively difficult for us to do these things, right? Because either we now have one-offs for every single thing we care about, or we eventually plug this thing over stream, which presumably means we lose all the value in the first place. So like it would be hard, right?
If a user really wants to write those things, they can always open a proposal for us to add those, and then we can implement them trivially as binary primitives, create, stack local buffer over long and call write.
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy that, because I mean, by that logic, you could say instead of having, exposing these two types, people can just, p invoke into the whatever the p function name was, right? Like it's all degrees of complexity, right? Like how.
Well, I'm saying that if users need it for those scenarios, we have a targeted scenario today, and this is essentially the minimal viable product. If users say they also need and want to be able to support primitives in the future, then we can provide that support when they request it. And it's trivial enough for anyone to provide an extension method that does that today as well, until we expose those additional surface area.
Yeah, that's the thing where I think I disagree. Like to me, it's hard to do abstractions later. Like basically, like abstractions is not the kind of thing where an MVP I think is necessarily the best approach, because once you have it, it is the shape you have it. And when you then start later to try to think about an abstraction, it's relatively difficult to like introduce them later. So like basically we have now one shot at these types. If we think there should be a common type, we should do it now. I don't think you can do that later. So that's a decision we have to make. I'm not saying we need to have it. It's just that I think that's the thing that gives us pause.
I was saying that there's not another abstraction needed on top of these. There's just potential additional methods you could expose on these classes. If you want to write along, then you're not going to have some wrapper around these. You can just expose read int64 async and write int64 async, just like there exists on StreamReader and Writer.
Right. Like, I mean, I guess it depends on the actual thing. Like, if that's the only thing you want to do, sure. But as soon as you talk about, let's say, JSON or XML, you don't want to have them directly on these types, right?
Right, but you also wouldn't put them on a common type in System.io. That's something that would exist in JSON itself and is a separate abstraction.
Testing has become quite popular in our ecosystem, and not having some sort of abstraction for this means that anyone who's a fan of testing is likely to create their own abstraction on top of these and never actually use our class directly. It seems like it would be cheap and worthwhile just to create an abstraction here from the get-go.
See, I disagree, because this is the power user, right? They don't want abstractions. They want to go to the metal, right? Like I like the alternative design, to tell you the honest truth. Like, I don't think we need classes for this. All they want to do is like call basically the OS API. Here's a file handle, here's some bytes, and here's the offset I want to read and write. Like I prefer this one, to tell you the honest truth, because it doesn't need to be simple for people. It's like they just want to go straight to the metal.
Yeah, if we're not making an abstraction, I think I would prefer these safe handle extensions rather than new classes.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense to me.
Do them as extensions, but like I think static method, like thinking of this as static methods rather than thinking of them as types, I think, at least in my view, helps with the whole exchange type argument, right? Because it's like, well, these are, as you said, power user low-level APIs. You're supposed to build your own stuff on top of that. And so that's why there's no abstractions, because, well, there's literally the worker method, so plug it in wherever you need it.
Well, I mean, when you say you wouldn't make them extension methods, do you mean you would have them be static methods that aren't extension, or that you would just modify, say, file handle?
No, I would probably make them just static methods on, say, file handle, probably. And then not having them as this, I would just say you have to pass in the file handle as the first argument. Because, I mean, these are power user APIs. We don't really care about how convenient the call side is, right?
At the same time, say file handle is not always usable or desirable, because it comes with its own overhead and abstractions that can be non-compatible with whatever you're doing under the covers. There's many pinvoke APIs, particularly in performance-oriented scenarios, that they avoid the file handle types at all costs because they cause so many issues for their library.
That's fair, but like the other proposal has this problem too, right? Because you can only construct these classes from a safe handle, right? Or a path for that matter, but that's practically the same thing, right?
Yeah, they support both like path and safe file handle. Another issue with safe file handle is that whenever we are accessing filestream.safeFileHandle, we are changing the internal behavior of filestream, because we assume that the handle has been exposed. So, for example, we cannot cache the file length because somebody might have modified outside. And so in the past, we were also verifying that the caller has not moved file offset. So, and also when this type when this property is accessed, we have to flash to disk the whatever was buffered. So kind of like accessing safe file handler from file stream is always expensive.
But you can create one if you have an endpointer already. If you already have the file handle, right? You don't have to go through the file stream for people calling this, or was that not your concern?
You can create it on your own. However, we don't expose a way for doing that in a cross-platform manner. So we kind of expect the power users to know Windows and Unix APIs and be able to implement that on their own. This is why this alternative proposal contains the open file method that would actually expose this logic that we have internally.
Right.
And
Okay.
you don't have to do new file stream dot handle, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, this is kind of like a bit in the weeds. I think to me, whether it's on save file handle doesn't really matter so much. I think that just to me, it's basically either we have a type or we have a static methods, right? These are really the two design points. And I was just saying, like, I would prefer static methods, even if they're on the new type or something. That would still be better than having a type where everybody would basically ask for an abstraction immediately.
I don't think they're asking for an abstraction. I think they'd ask for additional methods to be exposed.
Well, it depends on the scenario, right? Like if it's just primitives, yes. If it's things like, oh, I want to basically be able to do it into a memory buffer or to a file on disk, well, then I want some abstraction in between, which is basically the testing scenario or well, how do I do this on X document when I given do I just take a file path and then just use it in my implementation, or how would I actually implement these things, right?
We could just have it not be sealed, and then users can extend it and have their JSON asynchronous file stream writer.
But then now we need to make something virtual so that their mock can not write to the file system. Like I think it was Eric who brought it up. Seemed to be bringing it up from the mocking perspective of that people want to, well, I want to test using these APIs but not actually touch the file system. So now I need the abstraction, whether it be a class that you mess with, or now they're going to write the interface that they give their mock version, and etc.
Users who are mocking already have to do all kinds of things to work around types that aren't extensible. I'm honestly not concerned if they don't have the ability to override every bit of behavior on the class.
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I would say that there's two sides, right? There is you either believe in there is extensibility, but then you design for it, or you don't make it extensible. But I don't believe in let's just unseal the type and pretend it's extensible model, because that's certainly not getting it done either.
It's still extensible. It's just you can't override the behavior of, is this actually writing to a file or not? You can extend and you can build your own helpers on top of it.
But you can do that with extension methods.
Manner.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's virtuals, unless you need to track state, which arguably you don't need for most, unless you change behavior. Like, to me, unsealing the types wouldn't do much. Like, if we really believe we want to support mocking somehow, then we have to think about how would you actually do it if you want to just write to a buffer in memory, right? And that you can't just do that by subclassing this type.
And as I said in the past, I didn't introduce an abstraction because other kind of streams don't support this. So we cannot do it with socket, we cannot do it with a pipe. So, and for me, introducing an abstraction could be kind of a promise of like, maybe in the future we will implement more types that support it.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I said earlier. Like, I mean, to me, I'm not saying you need to. All I'm saying is that we should not kid ourselves that we can do this later. Like, we should make a decision now. Do we believe this is a zero-cost abstraction thing we do for power users? Which the trade-off is we don't abstract because that would increase the cost and friction. But then I think we should have a design that kind of communicates that. And to me, static methods are really the way to do that. I would just avoid types for that reason, because again, you have a class, the class allocates. I don't know, like I would try to make it as cheap as possible, and then just say, whatever you want to do, you do. Whatever abstraction you want to build, you build. If you want to have a buffer, a non-buffer version, you just decide how you want to call these methods. But we don't give you a pre-baked type to do that.
Have we looked at Azure SDK? I feel like I've seen that they have a random access device for their block system there. So an abstraction could be useful for them, at least.
I haven't. Could you please post a link to the source code?
Yeah, let me try to find it.
Might be easier to just ask somebody on Christoph's team.
Yeah.
But like, yeah.
All right, so I did some noodling in Notepad. So if we think that it isn't necessarily extension methods, though we could make them be extension methods, and I think Tanner was sort of arguing for a let me control the lifespan of the save file handle, just let me pass the int pointer and move on with life.
Yeah, but
So
I did some alternative implementation suggestion here.
in general, everything, so all of the properties that exposed int PTR in FileStream are obsolete.
Sure.
We are not using this, only save file handles. So I don't think that we should be introducing new APIs that are not using save file handle, but the other kind of handles.
I mean, again, that kind of depends on what you want to go for, right? I mean, what I understood from Tanner is that there's a cost to that, right? And if, I mean, save file handle like does some things for you, and if you need them, it's probably good to use. If you don't need them or you don't want them, right, that's the worst case, then maybe that's not the appropriate API. And if they're statics, I think it's okay to say we have overloads between save file handle and in PTR for the real user that wants to go down zero cost to the metal kind of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, but we still would have to verify that given handle supports seeking.
No, you don't.
And
Call the OS,
created.
it throws.
Yeah.
You're calling a bare metal method.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, we have a different behavior on Windows and Linux because they throw a different error.
Then,
Well, I mean,
then we
you
have
could-
to introduce a catch block and handle that.
no, the caller
Which might
does.
be okay, right? Because at that point you're already in the error condition, in which case you're not in a tight loop anymore, right?
The OS itself also does not throw an exception. It returns an error code,
Fair enough.
which we convert into whatever exception we want. But like WinForms, for example, they don't use these save file handles, and one reason is because they already have their own lifetime management code. When you look at the underlying window handle for a control, they have a native window which inherently wraps everything and does the lifetime management. And they don't want to have a save handle sitting on top of sitting in between there, because then every single operation they do, they have another layer of indirection to get the handle that they want for the p invoke. And you don't want to use the save file handles in the p invoke because sometimes it doesn't work the way you expect because the marshaller behaves a very particular way with them, and that's not always desirable. And in other cases, you might want to be doing customized logic with it. So there are many, many cases where you just don't want that file handle or where it's not appropriate.
Right.
I totally agree. And moreover, when it comes to handles, the behavior is different for both OSs. So on Unix, if you specify a handle that does not support seeking and you try to perform read at given offset, you get an error. However, on Windows, the offset is being ignored. So if you wrap it with a pipe with that, you will just perform a read from a random next n bytes from a pipe.
Which is
so this would be
the destructive read?
Yeah, which would be kind of a silent error and could lead to some, really unexpected behaviors.
That is when you accept an in PTR because you have no way to validate that handle. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
I think that might be an okay trade-off, right? I mean, that's maybe something we need to document then, but that would certainly be unfortunate because then you might actually lead people down the wrong path. But if we believe this is a power user API, yeah, I would prefer if we could fail rather than giving back garbage. But if we absolutely can and we need it for perf.
Yeah, I mean, so that comes
I'm
back
okay
to
with that.
what's the scenario? If the scenario is we can handle, we would maybe have some internal usages ourselves, and we figure that we're a better resource for hiding a common operation that is spelled a different way between our various platforms, then it feels like we're kind of exposing a low-level operation. And yeah, if you pass in PTR, caller beware. Like, you were responsible for making sure that the file handle's not closed, etc. The safe file handle, if you want it to have friendly errors of like, hey, I'm not seekable, then like that's fine. That's something that the object, I know that you were proposing, or having the object expose whether or not it believes it's seekable. So we could have a more friendly thing with a more friendly object. We could also make that be an extension method if we wanted. But I wonder if adding the safe file handle based things, if basically we have 12 consumers, and if we only expose it via safe file handle, that we're not going to get 8 of them.
Yeah. Like, I mean, this is the kind of problem that we often have, right? Like, I believe like there's either usability or there's performance, right? Like, and you have to decide what is the most important thing. Now, the thing in the middle always looks very appealing, but there's the real danger that you now have a usable API or a not quite usable API that's also not quite fast enough, right? So like then you have no customers, right? So if the primary goal is perf here, then I would almost say like, yeah, let's make this as zero cost as humanly possible, so that people that, and with reasonable usage, of course, but not exposing, let's say, raw pointers, but like still within reason where you can say you don't really pay for any sort of abstraction or cost. If you want to use the API, it's there. We make it cross-platform, so the heavy lifting is done. But yeah, it's not the most convenient because the expectation is you have it in your deep bowels of your code, and so you don't pay for any abstraction. I think that to me is a good design.
Keep in mind that we're performing IOs here, so that's going to take over the performance cost of any abstraction. Like, I don't think any abstraction is going to add meaningful performance characteristics here.
That's a fair counterpoint, I guess. And it's
we miss
clearly
the
to
8,
a file, but yeah.
If we miss the eight customers by not having in pointer, we can add in pointer later, right? When we get asked for it and proof that it actually affects a real world customer.
If we go the static methods route, yeah. If we go the add the new classes route, then we would then need to add the static operation. Like, because there's not a way to plumb that in with, I want you to do this without every time you call into the thing calling dangerous add reference and dangerous release, which is what the marshaller will do for a p-invoke using a safe handle.
I thought, okay. I was in my head that we threw away the classes.
No, sorry, yeah. And that's fair. I'm just like, we're making sure that was the context you were speaking in.
Yeah.
I meant if we're going with the static methods, we can do the in pointer ones later if we decide that we need them later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it would also definitely mean we should not make them extension methods on safe file handle, because that would be very weird.
I think it would be fine.
Well, you shouldn't name it safe file handle extensions for sure.
Right.
Well, I mean, like, it would be weird to have one method as an instance method because it's an extension method on safe file handle, and the overload is now not an extension method over in PTR, right? That seems weird, but also having it on in PTR would be equally weird. So it just seems inconsistent at that point.
I mean, to me, it's the same as the people who say that we shouldn't have non-extension methods on enumerable. It extends the things that it makes sense to extend, and it's available for things that it can also do. I wouldn't think it would be too weird to go from using an extension invocation of filehandle.write@offset to calling filehandleoperations.write@offset handle.
It's just discoverability, right?
Yeah, this is power.
Sure, but like same argument applies, right? Like people that want to do power users are also trying to figure out what to do next, right? So
indeed,
if you force them down in the static method syntax, it's very easy for them to discover, oh, there's an alternative that doesn't require a safe file handle. Awesome, I can do that. Like once you're into the, oh, this is always an instance method on safe file handle, then you may never discover them, right? So
yeah, I guess I don't know what modern usability studies say people are doing, but in the if you have your cursor set at read at offset and hit F1, then the documentation it would take you to would be the static method, because it, like, that's what it is, if it has a extension invocation. But
well,
yeah, I mean, again,
alert, nobody reads docs. Everybody complains that there are no docs, but nobody actually reads them.
And again, like, if we go from what can we add later, you can always add the this later. You just can't take it away. So
that's true. That's true. Yeah, I guess I'm not opposed to that. I mean, as our primary customer, do we, like, is that the Azure SDK, or like who's the primary person asking for this?
No, it's not SDK. It's a team that creates some server apps using .NET Core. Some high performance stuff.
Yeah, I guess it would be good whatever design we push you to, like, validate with them that makes sense to them. And if they say absolutely not, then we should go back to the drawing board. But
I think it's a good idea. So maybe I can take it back to them and discuss and get their opinion, because currently we are guessing, and for example, nobody has asked for int PTR support. So, yeah.
Yeah.
okay, so I think what we have is, in the review, we were against the new types.
But not all of us.
Not all of us, that's true. Some of us. Or did we say uninformed opinion strongly held or something? Yeah, and to be clear, like, I will not, like, flip a table over types either. Like, to me, it's just, it seems an easier sell to me to say these are power user APIs, they're aesthetics. You're supposed to use them somewhere. We don't give an abstraction or type for you, so we don't introduce any overhead. It's all on you. I don't know. Seems an easy design point to explain. I think you're missing a bunch of semicolons, but don't worry about it. I can fix it.
Yeah, what I meant to do was replace all right parentheses with right parenthesis throw null semicolon, or arrow throw null semicolon. But I'll let you do that later.
We should do an open collect for Jeremy so you can actually use a decent editor, not Notepad.
I have decent editors, just not on the machine that I stream from.
I see.
It doesn't come up often enough that I care. All right, so have I captured our commentary here?
Thank you.
Did I miss anything?
Going back to the customer, because rereading his original post, he's talking about, like, polling, which I don't see in the proposal.
I think in the original post he mentioned Windows-specific implementation details for the asynchronous version.
Right. Which begs a question, like, if, you know, is this actually going to meet their needs? Which I think it's important.
Yeah. Well, because this is bouncing it back as needs work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I added the weasel phrase. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Someone other than Adam. Adding classes as a target for requires unreferenced code attribute 50122. Do we have anyone here to talk about this?
Yeah. So this is a request for an extension on functionality that it already exists, which is the requires unreferenced code attribute. And we use this attribute to mark methods that are not compatible with trimming. And in case we use those methods, we'll present a warning whenever the method is being called. In general, it indicates that the specified method requires dynamic access for code, and that cannot be inferred statically, which usually means we are using some sort of reflection. And the request to extend it to classes, not only methods, which in the example that you can see there, the effect is that we will treat all methods as dangerous. And this helps to reduce the number of annotations that a developer has to make in case the whole type is not compatible for trimming. There is a comment from Stephen Top that is that, okay, if we support it for classes, why not to support it also for structs and interfaces, which is the alternative design. But the problem is that structs are problematic because they are default. They can be default instantiated, which if it's default instantiated, we consider that at all, and it will need to warn. And well, that's difficult. It's not only difficult to implement, but it's also problematic. So the discussion is for this, like, what should we apply the attribute to? But our proposal is only to use it for classes.
Yeah, so go ahead, Tanner.
I was going to say the language is looking at allowing default struct constructors finally.
Boo.
Again. Regardless what you think, Jeremy, it's probably going to happen. In which case, new T for a struct will actually call a constructor and not be default. In which case, it and activator.create new instance will likely do the same, because that's how it actually works if you define that in IL today. So I think struct likely needs to be handled, if not today, but in the near future.
It doesn't alleviate the concern of why structs are problematic, though.
The problem is actually implementing the checking.
Right, but structs are likely going to have this scenario where a generic instantiation, for example, will call an unreferenced constructor, or the same be a reflection.
I don't think that if we add the attribute usage, there's any scenario.
If needed, you can use what's today and put the requires unreferenced code on all the constructors of the struct and all the methods that are unsafe.
Yeah, so why is this only the static methods? Because that's what feels really weird to me. Of if I've put this on the class, it feels like it's, the whole class.
If you've warned on the static methods, you've already warned.
Well, but saying this attribute can now be put on a class, you're putting it on the class. The instance members aren't going to warn. Oh, I guess you're saying it does the constructor and the static members, because that will mean you've always talked about. You've always issued a warning for the type somewhere.
Yep. This is how obsolete attribute works, by the way.
And then,
makes sense.
And it also alleviates when you have a derived class that is unsafe. But today when you have requires unreferenced code on a virtual method, you have to have it on the whole hierarchy. And so a lot of times what we have is we have like a base class that's perfectly safe and a couple derived classes that are perfectly safe, but then there's one class that's doing unsafe things. And so it's nice to just slap the requires unsafe code on that class. But now if it applied to all the instance members, it'll apply to all the override method members, which means now it applies to the whole hierarchy again.
Right. But I mean, so logically speaking, it's saying it does apply to the instance members, but that you've already covered it because it was covered at construction time. And
Correct.
That it's, while the current code may be calling an instance member on the type, the unfriendliness came from the person who constructed it.
Correct.
Yep.
So if you, I don't know how infectious requires unreferenced code supposed to be, but if you have a parameter to a method that has one of these, are you yourself now considered requires unreferenced code? If it was on the class instead of on just a static method on the type?
No.
So you're calling an instance member of a thing that requires unreferenced, but you're not yourself requires unreferenced.
Correct.
Okay.
But that might mean I get no warning, right?
You yourself, that method doesn't get a warning, but whoever made that that requires unreferenced code type, passing it into you is going to get a warning.
I guess the existence of your method itself would have been trimmed out unless someone called it. So it's really again on the caller to have that created the I can't trim this because I'm scared. Okay.
Interesting.
I mean, really, the case. What this is trying to help with is just places where it's just the whole thing is just unsafe, and there's 50 or 100 methods in the class, and to attribute every single method on the class, or even all the constructors, and then somebody adds a new constructor later.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through the things where I see an attribute, apply it on a type, and if I understand what it means when I think that the semantics of it should apply. And while I had it's weird that you would not include instance members, but then it was you have because you got the constructor, so something somewhere got this warning already, and that's all I'm trying to talk through now.
And I think Andy's point earlier actually makes total sense here, is about obsolete. Like if you have an obsolete class, a class with an obsolete attribute on it, and then you have a method that takes in an instance of that class, are you obsolete? Do you have to be obsolete yourself?
Fair enough. I just it's without knowing what the total implications of this are. I didn't know if it was supposed to be like we have our unsupported API or unsupported platform stuff, right? It's so if you call one, now you need to paint yourself as I'm not supported on this OS, or you have to have a guard that makes it look like you did something sensible. So I didn't know if unreferenced code was the same way.
It's basically the same. So the question is, what do we do for parameters in that case? Honestly, I could go either way. It also doesn't really matter that much. Like, regardless of what behavior we choose, we're sticking attribute targets.class on the attribute. I mean, we can talk about the ways of the intricacies of each little detail, but like
no, I like
no matter what.
I'm just making sure that we're not setting ourselves up for we have something that looks like it should work and we have a hole, and I think I'm convinced that everything is covered. Interfaces definitely shouldn't get it because interfaces are just syntax. The requires unreferenced code is about implementation and behavior.
They're no longer just syntax, particularly with
true.
DIMs and
Fair enough.
Static abstracts and interfaces, which will probably not support DIMs in the first release, but which may in a future release.
All right. Thank you for reminding me that I live in the Stone Ages.
It's also just about type safety, right? So like consider requires unreferenced code on the implementer of an interface. Now the interface itself should probably have requires unreferenced code on the method because it's type unsafe otherwise.
Maybe. I mean, like, if you have a dispose that requires unreferenced code attribute, we're not going to go paint idisposable.dispose as requires unreferenced code.
Yeah.
No, what we do there is we paint the constructors, right? We say, because there's the same thing with like get hash code and equals. I've seen those where they're doing unsafe things, and we need to attribute the constructors in those cases.
Right, I'm saying we wouldn't go back to the idisposable interface and say that because we found an implementation of this somewhere that was unreferenced
totally.
code.
Yeah, it's more like, look, it's about best effort here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I just checked obsolete.
The result
obsolete real quick, that it does warn you if you have a parameter with an obsolete on it.
Yep, it does. I don't know what Emo's platform analyzers do.
I don't think we warn on the type. I think we warn on the usage of the type. So the parameter is fine. Like what really matters is what you're doing with it. If you're just passing it through, nobody cares. If you actually call a method on it, then it will probably warn. Because it's about what, code you're executing, right? Just accepting and returning things is fine. Because you're not calling any code on it.
And we could credibly argue the same here, that passing it through is fine for requires unreferenced code, because the problem was the original caller was the one who did something unsafe, and now you're just propagating it.
Yeah, I think you convinced me, Andy, that being on the constructor means you've already covered it as a parameter. The problem isn't this method, it's whoever instantiated it and then called this method. So your graph is already going to be tracking that unreferenced code is in your universe.
And so what was the hard thing with structs again? Is it because of copy semantics?
And default, I think.
I see.
I think just class is fine today, but I think as the linker gets extended to beyond the BCL and starts getting used by external third-party code, we're going to have to add structs and interfaces.
I mean,
I would say that we should only add things that we can implement. So we should not promise things that we cannot implement. And so if the linker ever actually supports warning on them, then we should consider adding it. But until then, there's no point.
I would agree with that too, because I mean, you don't want to live in a world where you can put it on structs but nothing happens, but then we change the linker and now people get warnings and they get mad at us again. Like, yeah, if that requires implementation changes in the linker, I'm fine with saying let's start with classes and then add structs later.
Yeah, so I can commit to adding class support before .NET 6 ships. I can't commit to adding anything else.
You're a lead for too long.
Says the PM.
Hey, I'm an IC PM. I don't own resources. I can promise the world.
I can show you the world.
I watched that movie the other night. All right.
That makes sense to me.
Am I doing this in the wrong order for your tool, Emo? Or will it pick these things up?
No, the order doesn't matter. Like,
good.
What matters is the time.
All right. Looks like Tarek, are you on the call? What do we have from the base UTC offset? I thought we approved this.
No, actually, this is reviewed last Friday, and we got some feedback during the design review. And this is I'm bringing back just after addressing the concerns that raised. So if you go,
well, do you think it's like a 3-second thing or like a 15-minute thing?
Guys, we have someone from the Prague team on the call right now, so
fair enough.
For this compression support. So I'd rather make sure we get through this.
Okay.
Yeah, that was if the UTC offset was a rubber stamp. I was going to try and knock it out, but that was my question. But we'll just talk about the WebSocket with the 10 minutes we have left.
So we previously approved this API, and then we discovered that there are some very sneaky attacks that involve compression and encryption being used together. So we've come back with some small changes proposed just to try to help mitigate users accidentally falling into that trap. If you scroll, I think the updates are all the way at the bottom of the comments list.
As a diff?
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So we think we want to name the deflate options to dangerous deflate options, just with some nice documentation saying why it's dangerous and how they might mitigate it. Because otherwise it's really not obvious that there's an issue. And second, we're adding these WebSocket message flags. One of them is just taking an existing bool parameter and turning it into a flag, and the other is the ability to disable compression on a per message basis. Essentially, you would use this to mitigate the issue as well by if you have any secret data and user data, you would split them into two separate messages, keeping one uncompressed so that it doesn't impact the other one.
Okay, so I have two obvious things. One, you should name the zero value on the flags to none. And two, especially because compression is the using it is the dangerous. I think that you want none to be your default. Because if you'd already shipped this and we were adding compression and somebody was already calling this API and setting a value, we don't want the fact that the third bit was not yet defined to mean that they're now accidentally assigning dangerous behavior. So given your name of dangerous, the on bits are the dangerous mode and the off bits are the safe mode.
Yeah. I have a comment on that. It's because even if you state the deflate options, this has to go through negotiation and server can decline compression. So even if you set the deflate option and you go and opt in for compression, it still wouldn't mean that this is compressed. So it may be confusing.
Sure. Well, you've said you've enabled compression. You're not forcing compression. You're not compressing. It's you are allowing compression to happen. And the allowing that is the dangerous thing.
So Jeremy, I think what your suggestion is to, instead of disable compression, have an enable compression flag or something of that ilk.
Yeah, and if end of message is the dangerous thing, then
that is not the dangerous thing.
Right. I'm aware that compression is dangerous. I don't know if end of message has a, but basically it's like you need to think about it from the context of 4 versions from now. Like somebody will have built up what they think the right value of WebSocket message flags is, and if four versions from now you add a new flag, they're already passing that the value that they want is 1. And if that means that they're now accidentally opting into a behavior that they wouldn't have wanted, given that the name is dangerous, like that's bad. So to me, this feels like it needs to be all opt-ins and not any opt-outs. I guess, but really the answer is the 0 value should represent the default thing, and the 1 value should represent the thing that you have to toggle.
Yeah, so initially we designed the API like that. What we found is that if you enable compression, typically you want to enable compression for all messages. And the scenario where you are sending both user influenceable data and secret data with WebSockets is relatively rare. So we think that okay, let me restart. If you have existing people calling into WebSockets to send messages, they're using the existing API without any flags, and you know that that code is safe, then it's beneficial for you to be able to just enable it in one place and have it be used everywhere, because that's the 99% use case of what people are going to want to do.
So you're saying that the current code as exists is already doing compression?
It is not doing compression. Disable compression will only take any effect if you actually enable it through this WebSocket creation options. So if you keep dangerous deflate options to null, which is the default, then disable compression will have no effect.
Right. So and this makes sense from an initial implementation. like because it's a brand new API. But if we were adding support for compression right now, then anyone who was already setting options, they would now be, because it's the 0 state is on, they would be accidentally implicitly turning on compression. And that's why the 0 bit needs to represent the default, and the default needs to be safe.
Well, I think the idea is, so like, let's say you ship this
value.
Yeah, let's say we already shipped this, right? Let's pretend we already have the message flags, and now we're adding compression, right? So let's just pretend that's the world we're living in, right? The idea, I think, is that whoever turned on dangerous deflate options is now also on the hook to change the call sides to send async to opt out the messages where it makes sense to opt them out, and we don't know which ones that is, right? So like I think the idea is it's opt-in at the root level and it's opt-out per message level. But if you're the one opting in at the root level, you're on the hook to opt out the individual messages. So it's okay if existing code still doesn't opt out because existing code hasn't opted in at the root level.
Right, but again, if we did this across 2 versions, and all that we had right now was end of message, and you'd set up your WebSocket creation as, oh, turn on end of message. So now we ship the next version, and now it's because you have moved it off of null, you're setting it to 1. 1 means you didn't set the second bit, which means compression is now on. And we believe that compression should be off by default.
Well, maybe I'm missing something, but my understanding is, it is off by default, right? Like you have to literally go to the creation options and set it on. This is just at the message level, the opt out, right? Like
no, it's the same. It's the same flags used for both the WebSocket creation and the individual message.
No, this flag is only passed to send async. The WebSocket deflate options do not use the flag.
Yeah, so there's flags and there's the options. It's a different type. So basically, the WebSocket deflate options is the global thing, and then the WebSocket message flags is the per message opt out.
I missed that. I thought they were the same type. Apply that, and probably most of my comments make sense now. Okay, so this is. So somebody still has to do an explicit gesture to turn on compression for the WebSocket, and then now they can opt out the message. Okay, that makes more sense.
And opting out is the flag that we want to use because we think that very few people will actually want to opt out.
And I guess you can't opt in for a message if the socket itself didn't already set up the context.
Yes.
So it doesn't make sense. Okay. Yes. Now that I've read, it makes more sense. So I apologize.
So one question I have is, now we are living in this luxurious world that we can actually rename the property from deflate options to dangerous deflate options, but what are we doing for things like HTTP client where we already have a global setting for turning on automatic compression?
Sorry, say that again.
So like we haven't shipped deflate options properties yet, right? So we can still rename them from deflate options to dangerous deflate options, right? I'm asking, what would you do, or what are we doing for HTTP client where we already have automatic compression built into the client API and it's not prefixed with danger?
That's a question we asked, and we don't have an answer for that. We'll probably look at that in another issue if we choose to look at it at all. It is off by default in HTTP client, at least, so there's no imminent security threat to everybody.
But that's the same here, right? You have to literally set it to turn it on, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so like I'm not morally opposed to renaming this thing to dangerous. I just don't think it's a pattern that actually, for security, in my opinion, makes sense, because like the assumption is usually by the time you find out that you fucked up your APIs, like it's too late.
Yeah, well, because with HTTP web request, I don't remember when we added HTTP client, but with HTTP web request at least, we had the API. I'm pretty sure we had the API before the attack was known. So it was at that time it was you're opting into a thing that the server may not support, or you're assuming that you can compress faster than you can transmit, which is generally the case, but not always on limited resource devices and such. So it was a like, this is a sort of a space versus time decision that you're making, and now we know it's a dangerous space versus time decision that you're making, and the answer is you don't want to do it unless it's something like a HTML file. Like an HTML file that's statically generated, not HTML content. And here you're sending a lot of messages, so they're probably all data, so it's probably always the wrong idea. But so I think we've learned here, and if we felt that it was super risky with HTTP client, we would obsolete the one and rename it to dangerous just to put it in your face, or we'd add a new analyzer. I think we have 1 million security analyzers. We'd find one that people actually don't turn off because it's not too noisy, and we'd add a noisy thing to it. And then they would turn it off.
Actually, I would add, in HTTP client, we don't have request compression support. We only have automatic decompression support. So in that case, you could say that we're relying on the server to have made the correct choice for us. We're just using whatever the API demands.
Yeah, you basically have to trust the machine you get the response from, right? Because they can send you basically zip bombs, right? And then bad things might happen, or whatever the equivalent for deflate is.
Yeah, the person who owns the unsafeness of this is the one doing the compression.
I see, for this particular attack, because it's really about compressing user data.
With respect to crime, yeah.
I mean, so I guess, yeah, I mean, again, like, I'm not opposed. I mean, usually we use dangerous for things where you're basically bypassing the type system, right? Which is kind of an inherent property of the API, rather than we find later on that, in the workflow and how you use the API, you might do something unsafe. That's why just gives me pause, because it basically means we need to get this right the first time, and that I don't have confidence in. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, we can say, look, there's something we learned. If we could rename the thing on HTTP client, we wouldn't, because it's a different workflow. But yeah, I guess it's fine.
Yeah, I know that we've typically used dangerous for memory unsafe and type unsafe things, but in this case, it's a really easy pit to fall into without noticing it. So we think it's good to call out so that people at least hopefully look at documentation.
Yeah, the one thing you need to be careful with, though, and that is kind of, again, I don't have a good suggestion here, it's just something you need to keep in mind, is you don't want to use this term inflationary, right? Because so let's say, and I completely make up stuff now to just make my point, but let's say that 90% of usages of WebSockets don't have user supplied data, right? It's just whatever the protocol is that the person wrote. If you teach everybody to basically say, yeah, just ignore the dangerous thing here because I know I own everything, you do the opposite of what you're trying to do, right? You try to reach awareness, but that only works when it's rare. If people are forced to use it a lot to get their job done, the prefix loses its value, right? So it's kind of, if you smack people in the face, the same with warnings, right? If you raise too many warnings, at some point the value of the warnings disappears, right? You want high noise, high signal to noise ratio, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind, is if you rename this to dangerous, well, like, is this the rare thing to do? Then it's okay. If it's a very common thing to turn on, you might actually do yourself a disservice by forcing everybody to call an API that's called dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, we mostly wanted to avoid the scenario where someone says, oh, compression will be good because I'm on a mobile device, or, it's very easy for someone to say, yeah, compression sounds good, I can use less bandwidth, but they don't really understand the whole ramification of that decision. I don't know how common enabling compression is for WebSockets. It is a somewhat popular ask for us, so I think someone wants it. I don't know if they would actually use it.
Yeah. I mean, really, we're using it as a prefix meaning RTFM, but
yes,
A, that would be an abbreviation, and B, it's not a very polite one. And
depends on the interpretation of what the F stands for, I guess. But
friendly,
I mean,
obviously,
or fine, right? But I think this is something that, it's a judgment call, right? So that's why I'm saying I don't have a good suggestion, but like, you should make sure that it is somewhat rare. Like, if it is very common and if it's a very popular request, you may live in a world where everybody ignores it and turns it on, and at that point the value becomes, inversely proportional, basically, right?
Yeah, because like with safe handle, dangerous get handle, it's you've touched this and now safe handle can't save you anymore.
Yeah.
And I can't think of other dangerouses off the top of my head.
Yeah, what's the undangerous way to turn on compression?
To not compress. To go with the default algorithm of...
the undangerous way is to be very, very, very careful about what data you're sending.
Yeah, which we can't do for you. I mean, it basically boils down to you have to read the manual and make sure you're harden your own code correctly. But it is like the problem with dangerous, it's a bit like a cop-out, right? Basically, we're saying like, we wash our hands. We told you that if you fuck it up, you fuck it up and you're on your own, right? But like that only works when we use it sparingly, right? Otherwise, let's prefix every API with dangerous and then just move on with live, but that doesn't work.
I mean, the good thing to consider is that WebSocket is a relatively rare class for someone to use. So I don't think we would be polluting the public mindset of what dangerous means here, even if this did end up becoming a common thing for people to enable with WebSockets.
I mean, it kind of comes to the other thing, right? So like if this is an implementation detail of some high level protocol, like, I don't know, SignalR, for example, in ASP.NET, they shouldn't turn it on clearly, right? They should expose it to their users because, they don't know, obviously, whether you put in user supply data or not. Yeah.
I will add that ASP has a flag to enable outbound compression. It is not named dangerous or anything. I'm not sure if it was introduced before crime was known about, but that's something to consider.
Yeah, that's kind of my high-level question is like, regardless of the the actual mechanics here, but like we should make sure that if we rely on renaming, that we catch all the cases where people would opt into this behavior, right? So if there's an ASP.NET feature, for example, that they already shipped, then maybe we have to invest in an analyzer anyway to make sure that we catch everybody else. At which point, I would argue the name probably doesn't do much anyway because you have to write an analyzer. So either way would work at that point.
So the existing member that you show for send async has end of message and cancellation token both as formal parameters. Is end of message actually required?
Yes. Well,
because
you send it on
my
the
question
last
here is
part of your message.
right. Well, my question here is, should WebSocket message flags be defaulted? Is where I'm going with that.
Oh, it could be defaulted. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess that wouldn't be ambiguous with the call site.
Because if the current Boolean is already required, then we could add the default, and you're fine. If there's some sort of ambiguity somewhere, then we couldn't. But I'm just asking.
Yeah, we could add a default. I'm not sure how common, or I'm not sure what's the most common scenario. I suspect most people just have one message per send async call, so a default member might end up being specified every time anyway. But I don't have data around that.
Okay, I'll put it down as consider.
See. Yeah.
Oh, and Right.
Yeah, I think you should add the other thing, which is make sure that if they're high-level APIs like ASP.NET, SignalR, for example, that if you want to make people aware that compression might be a bad idea, that we have corresponding action there, either by renaming or analyzer or whatever the mechanism is. Because we probably have more users for SignalR than we have for raw WebSocket, so if the goal is to contain the damage, that might not be the flag you want to look for anyway.
Don't need that dangling bullet. All right.
And you should probably change the syntax highlighting to div. Just saying.
Oh, yep.
Yeah. Sounds good to me.
Any other feedback? All right, so approved with feedback.
Thank you.
So for the other blocking one, is this something that needs to be done today, or is it okay if we push this out to whatever the next meeting is?
Mine is okay to push to next meeting.
The other ones I don't even know. There's the pod reload one, and then there is the JSON one. I guess the JSON one is longer, right? It wasn't that one that requires more discussion.
Probably.
And then I don't even know what the pod reload one is.
Yeah, it wasn't on your agenda, but since you told me JSON was last, I inserted it because it was showing up as blocking.
Yeah, looks like so we meet on Thursday, so it's only 2 days, so.
All right.
I don't have a meeting in my calendar for Thursday.
That is funny. Did I only send it out to myself?
I have it from 1 to 3.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I was looking at the wrong time slot.
Yeah, that's possible.
You expected it was in the morning.
Yes, like it normally is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can probably move it to the morning. I don't know why I booked it for the afternoon. I think it was for the last time, and apparently I changed the series, which wasn't the intent. So I will probably move it to the morning slot. Because we tend to be more productive in the morning than in the afternoon. All right, then I see you all on Thursday, I guess. Jeremy, thanks for hosting.
Anytime.
I had a good time in tactics, which is not something people often say.
True. All right. See you, everybody.